On February 8th, 1587 in Fotheringhay Castle. The air in the great hall was heavy and close, saturated with the smells of unwashed bodies, fear, and damp stonework. The frosty dawn reluctantly broke through the tall, lancet windows, and its pale light fell upon the faces of hundreds of witnesses gathered to behold the finale of a drama that had lasted nearly half a century. In the center of the hall, hastily constructed and covered in black cloth, stood a scaffold. It was ominously empty, save for a chair upholstered in black velvet, a cushion for the knees, and the centerpiece, a block, polished to a dull sheen by hands that already knew their trade. The silence was almost absolute, broken only by a cough, the nervous shuffling of feet, and the booming of a heart that, it seemed, everyone could feel in their own chest. No one yet knew that on this very day, in this damp English castle, the threads of fate of two queens and two nations would be woven into a bloody knot that would change the course of history forever. Dark shadows were gathering over England and Scotland. Ancient prophecies seemed about to come to life, and on the streets of London and Edinburgh, whispers of the coming denouement had long been circulating. And then the doors opened. The distinct click of heels echoed in the silence. She entered. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scotland by right of birth, Queen of France by marriage, claimant to the throne of England by blood. A woman whose name, for some, was synonymous with martyrdom and divine right, and for others a symbol of conspiracy, debauchery, and betrayal. She was 44 years old, but 19 years of captivity had left their mark. Her figure, once slender and graceful, had grown full, yet in every movement, in her proudly held head, in the calm, almost disdainful gaze with which she surveyed the crowd, an unbroken royal bearing shone through. She was dressed in a black velvet gown with a white collar and cuffs, like a widow mourning not a husband but her own fate. In her hands she held an ivory crucifix, and at her waist hung a rosary. She ascended the scaffold without assistance, refusing the Earl of Shrewsbury's hand. Her movements were measured, devoid of haste. This was not a victim going to the slaughter, but a monarch ascending her final throne. When the sentence was read to her, she listened with a slight, almost imperceptible smile, as if it concerned someone else. Then she delivered her final speech, which was not a plea for mercy, but an affirmation of her faith and her innocence before God, if not before men. Her voice, clear and strong, carried through the hall, and even her enemies involuntarily froze listening to the Queen's last words. And then something unimaginable began. The executioners approached to help her remove her outer garments, but she stopped them with a gesture. Her two ladies-in-waiting, weeping, stepped forward. And when the black gown fell to the floor, the crowd gasped. Underneath was an underdress of scarlet, blood-red velvet, the color of the liturgical vestments of Catholic martyrs. This was her final, silent, and most powerful argument. She was dying not as a criminal, but as a martyr for her faith. She knelt, forgave her executioners, and laid her head on the block, saying in Latin, "In manus tuas, Domine, commendo spiritum meum," which means, "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." The first blow of the axe struck the back of her neck. A muffled groan escaped her throat. The executioner struck again, and only with the third blow did the head, crowned with auburn locks streaked with gray, separate from the body. When the executioner's assistant picked it up by the hair to show the crowd, a final, gruesome metamorphosis occurred. The head slipped from his grasp, and a gray, almost bald skull fell onto the scaffold. The luxurious hair had been a wig concealing the marks of time and suffering. Thus ended the life of Mary Stuart. But her story, a story of beauty, power, passion, betrayal, and blood, was just beginning. To understand how a girl crowned in her cradle ended up on an English scaffold, we must return to the very beginning, to a cold and war-torn Scotland, where in December of 1542, in Linlithgow Palace, the first cry of a newborn queen was heard. Before the woman became a legend and the queen a symbol, there was only a fragile child born in a kingdom's hour of despair. 16th century Scotland was a harsh, untamed land caught between the hammer of English expansion and the anvil of French ambitions. Its kings rarely died in their beds, and the throne was not so much a symbol of power as a target. And into this world of intrigue and steel, into a dynasty of which it was said that it came with a lass and will pass with a lass, a girl was born. No one could have foreseen that her life would become the most tragic and captivating chapter in the history of the House of Stuart, and that her fate would be a mirror reflecting all the religious and political storms of the era. December of 1542 was particularly raw and grim in Scotland. A cold wind from the North Sea chilled to the bone, and fogs seemed to have permanently shrouded the hills and glens. The country was in mourning and disarray. Just a few weeks earlier, on November 24th, the Scottish army had suffered a crushing and humiliating defeat by the English at the Battle of Solway Moss. It was not so much a battle as a shameful rout. The Scottish nobility, torn by internal strife and sympathies for different factions, failed to mount a worthy resistance. King James V, the nephew of the powerful English monarch Henry VIII, was broken. He was a passionate, impetuous man, but prone to melancholy. The defeat was the final straw for him. He retreated to his hunting lodge at Falkland Palace, refusing food and company, sinking into a quagmire of despair. He was tormented by a fever, but his main illness was a mortal sorrow. Both of his sons, from his marriage to the French aristocrat Mary of Guise, James and Arthur, had died in infancy the previous year, and now the dynasty's only hope was the pregnant queen awaiting childbirth at Linlithgow Palace. And so, on December 8th, 1542, Mary of Guise gave birth. But it was not the news that could heal the dying king. A healthy, strong girl was born. When the messenger brought this news to Falkland, James V, according to tradition, uttered his last prophetic words. It came with a lass. It will pass with a lass. He was referring to Marjorie Bruce, the daughter of King Robert the Bruce, through whose marriage to Walter Stuart the crown had passed to their dynasty in the 14th century. 6 days after his daughter's birth, on December 14th, the 30-year-old King James V passed away. Thus, at the age of just 6 days, Mary Stuart became Queen of Scotland. Her cradle, from the very beginning, was surrounded not by caring nurses, but by a pack of hungry political wolves. Scotland immediately split into two camps. The pro-English faction was led by James Hamilton, Earl of Arran, the newborn queen's closest relative and her heir. Arran was a weak, indecisive man, easily influenced and secretly sympathetic to the rising tide of Protestantism. He was supported by the nobles captured at Solway Moss and released by Henry VIII on the promise of aiding his plans. And the English king's plan was simple and brilliant: to marry his son, Prince Edward, to the young Mary Stuart, and thus peacefully, through a dynastic marriage, unite the two kingdoms under the English crown. This policy came to be known as the Rough Wooing. The pro-French faction, or the Auld Alliance, relied on the Catholic Church and the nobility, who had been linked to France for centuries by ties of trade, culture, and politics. Their leader was the powerful and cunning Cardinal David Beaton, Archbishop of St. Andrews, a zealous defender of Catholicism and an implacable enemy of English influence. Beside him stood the Queen Dowager, Mary of Guise, an intelligent, educated, strong-willed woman and utterly devoted to the interests of her daughter and the alliance with France. Initially, the Anglophiles gained the upper hand. The Earl of Arran was proclaimed regent. In July of 1543, the Treaty of Greenwich was signed, under which Mary was to go to England at the age of 10 and marry Edward. It seemed that Scotland's fate was sealed, but Mary of Guise and Cardinal Beaton were not about to surrender. They sheltered the little queen and her mother in the impregnable Stirling Castle, a true eagle's nest of Scottish kings. On September 9th, 1543, the 9-month-old Mary was crowned in the castle chapel. The ceremony was as grand as circumstances allowed. The tiny girl was held by Lord Livingston. They attempted to place the coronation ring on her finger, draped a mantle over her shoulders, and held the scepter and sword before her. This ritual was not merely a formality, but a powerful political statement that Scotland had its own God-given queen and would not give her up without a fight. Henry VIII was furious. Realizing that the Scots had tricked him and had no intention of fulfilling the treaty, he switched from wooing to violence. In 1544, English troops under the command of the Earl of Hertford invaded Scotland. They burned Edinburgh, plundered the abbeys of Melrose and Kelso, and devastated the fertile lands of Lothian. It was a scorched earth tactic designed to force the Scots to submit, but it had the opposite effect. The cruelty of the English only strengthened national resistance and alienated even those who had previously sympathized with the Union. The internal political struggle in Scotland also reached its peak. In May of 1546, a group of Protestant nobles incited from England stormed St. Andrew's Castle and brutally murdered Cardinal Beaton. His mutilated body was hung from the castle wall. This murder deprived the pro-French party of its strongest leader, but simultaneously turned him into a martyr and made compromise impossible. Now, the full weight of the struggle fell on the shoulders of Mary of Guise. She proved to be an outstanding politician. Understanding that Scotland could not stand alone without external help, she turned to France. King Henry II of Valois, England's eternal rival, could not miss such a chance to strengthen his influence in the north of the British Isles. He proposed an even more tempting marital alliance, the hand of the little Scottish queen for his son, the Dauphin, that is, the heir to the throne, Francis. For Scotland, this was a life-saving choice. In exchange for the future crown of France, the country received immediate military aid. In 1548, a 6,000-strong French expeditionary force arrived in Scotland. The French helped to recapture key fortresses from the English and besieged St. Andrew's Castle, capturing the murderers of Cardinal Beaton. Among the prisoners sent to the French galleys was a certain John Knox, a fiery preacher whose name would be heard again in our story. The price for help was high, but the Scottish Parliament gathered at Haddington Priory agreed. On July 7th, 1548, the marriage contract was signed. The 5-year-old Mary Stuart was officially betrothed to the Dauphin Francis. Her fate was decided. It was time to leave her harsh, tormented homeland. On August 7th, 1548, hiding from English ships that patrolled the east coast, the little queen boarded a French ship in the port of Dumbarton on the west coast of Scotland. With her went her loyal companions, 4 girls from noble Scottish families who went down in history as the 4 Marys: Mary Beaton, Mary Fleming, Mary Livingston, and Mary Seton. They sailed not east but around Scotland and Ireland to avoid the enemy. The journey was long and perilous, but after a week, the royal galley dropped anchor off the coast of Brittany. The little Queen of Scotland set foot on the soil of France, the country that would become her second home, the place of her triumph and her first great loss. From the stormy sea and misty Scottish shores, she stepped directly into the dazzling but venomous light of the French court. The Valois court in the mid-16th century was the center of European culture, the arbiter of fashion, the focus of arts and sciences. But beneath the glittering surface of Renaissance splendor lay a labyrinth of intrigue, where a smile could be deadlier than a dagger and love and power were inextricably linked. It was into this snake pit in lace that the little wild princess from the north was brought. she would either have to transform into one of the most exquisite and dangerous inhabitants of this terrarium, or be eaten alive. The France to which Mary Stuart arrived was another world. If Scotland was a stern, ascetic warrior in a worn coat of mail, then France was an exquisite lady in silks and velvets, perfumed and bedecked with jewels. The court of King Henry II and his wife, Catherine de' Medici, was the most brilliant, most cultured, and most dissolute court in Europe. Here not only valor and noble birth were valued, but also wit, knowledge of Latin and Greek, the ability to compose poetry, to dance, and to conduct refined conversation. Little Mary was received with royal honors. For Henry II, she was not just his son's fiancée, but a key figure in his geopolitical game. He called her the most perfect child, and from the beginning treated her with more tenderness than his own daughters. He saw in her the future Queen of France, and more importantly, through her, the future Queen of England. For the Catholic world, the Protestant Elizabeth, daughter of Henry VIII, and Anne Boleyn was illegitimate, and Mary Stuart, as the great-granddaughter of King Henry VII Tudor, had impeccable rights to the English throne. The coats of arms of Mary and the Dauphin Francis were, from the start, depicted combined with the arms of England, a clear hint at future claims. Mary was housed in the royal nursery with the children of Henry and Catherine. Colossal attention was paid to her education. She proved to be an exceptionally capable student. By her teenage years, she spoke fluent French, Latin, Italian, and Spanish, knew Greek, and, of course, her native Scots. She sang beautifully, played the lute and harpsichord, danced magnificently, and adored falconry and horse riding. Her tutor in poetry was the great Pierre de Ronsard, who dedicated ecstatic poems to her, calling her more beautiful than the morning dawn. She grew and blossomed. From a slightly wild Scottish girl, she transformed into a dazzling beauty. Contemporaries unanimously describe her as unusually tall for a woman of that time, about 180 centimeters or 5 feet 11 inches, slender with a graceful figure, pale skin, golden auburn hair, and hazel eyes that, depending on the light, seemed either brown or greenish. Her main weapon was an irresistible charm. She knew how to listen, how to captivate, and men lost their heads over her. Her fiancé, the Dauphin Francis, on the other hand, was not so blessed by nature. He was short, sickly, and a shy youth who suffered from chronic infections. But Mary, raised to understand dynastic duty, treated him with sincere tenderness and care. A warm, friendly relationship developed between them. However, life at court was not only a celebration but also a school of survival. Mary found herself at the center of a most powerful court clan. Her relatives on her mother's side, the Guises. Her uncles, Francis, Duke of Guise, and Charles, Cardinal of Lorraine, were the most influential men in France after the king. The Duke was a brilliant military commander, a hero of the wars with Spain, and the Cardinal was an intelligent and ruthless politician, the head of the Catholic party. They adored their niece and saw her as an instrument for strengthening their own power. Their main rival was Queen Catherine de' Medici. This Italian from the famous Florentine banking family was an exceptionally intelligent, secretive, and power-hungry woman. Having endured years of humiliation as a supposedly barren wife, she had learned to wait and to weave intrigues with truly Florentine skill. She watched the young Scotswoman, who was more beautiful, more charming, and more loved by the king than her own children, with poorly concealed hostility. Catherine saw how the Guises, through their niece, were pushing her away from the levers of influence, turning the court into their own domain. It was a hidden but constant war, waged with hints, intrigues, and, as was whispered in the dark corners of the Louvre, poisons. Catherine, a master of secret politics, surrounded herself with astrologers like Nostradamus and maintained a so-called flying squadron, a group of lovely ladies-in-waiting who, using their charms, extracted state and personal secrets from foreign ambassadors and frivolous courtiers, reporting everything to their mistress. Mary, without knowing it, was under constant, invisible surveillance. Her every breath and word were analyzed and weighed. Another important figure at court was Diane de Poitiers, the all-powerful favorite of King Henry II. She was 20 years older than the king, but managed to bind him to her for life. Fortunately for Mary, Diane favored her, seeing her more as an ally against Catherine than a rival. In this atmosphere, Mary learned to hide her true feelings behind a polite smile, to calculate her moves in advance, and to trust no one completely. It was a brilliant but cruel school that prepared her for the role of a monarch, but perhaps deprived her of the ability to understand the true motives of people, especially those who did not belong to her sophisticated circle. Time passed. In 1558, an event occurred that hastened the denouement. The forces of the Duke of Guise recaptured the port of Calais from the English, the last English stronghold on the continent which they had held for over 200 years. It was a triumph for the Guises and all of France. On the wave of this success, it was decided to hold the wedding of Mary and Francis. On April 24, 1558, the most magnificent wedding of the century took place in the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. The 15-year-old Mary was dazzling in her white gown, embroidered with pearls and diamonds, a bold move as white was considered the color of mourning for French queens, with a long train carried by pages. On her head shone a crown adorned with the famous Great Hairy Diamond. The 16-year-old Dauphin looked pale and frail beside her. All of Paris rejoiced, but behind the splendid facade lay a secret deal. Before the wedding, the Guises persuaded their young and inexperienced niece to sign a secret document. According to it, in the event of her death without issue, the rights to the crowns of Scotland and potentially England would pass to the King of France. This was, in essence, high treason against her own country. Mary, raised in France and seeing it as her true homeland, signed the papers without fully realizing their consequences. A few months later, in November of 1558, Queen Mary Tudor, nicknamed Bloody Mary, died in England. Her half-sister, Elizabeth I, ascended the throne. For Catholic Europe, Elizabeth was a heretic and a usurper. Henry II immediately declared his daughter-in-law, Mary Stuart, the legitimate Queen of England. From that moment, a deadly enmity began between the two women who had never met that would last their entire lives. In the summer of 1559, during a jousting tournament held in honor of his daughter's wedding, King Henry II was mortally wounded. A splinter from the lance of the Count of Montgomery pierced his eye. After 10 days of agony, the king died. His son ascended the throne as Francis II. Mary Stuart, at the age of 16, became Queen of France. This was the peak of her power and glory. She was simultaneously the queen of 2 kingdoms. Her uncles, the Guises, effectively ruled the country in the name of the weak and sickly king. Catherine de Medici was pushed into the background. It seemed a brilliant future awaited Mary, but the wheel of fortune had already begun its inexorable downward turn. The short reign of Francis II was marred by religious turmoil. The Protestants, or Huguenots, were gaining strength in France and were dissatisfied with the dominance of the Catholic Guises. In 1560, the Amboise conspiracy was uncovered, which aimed to kidnap the king and remove the Guises from power. The conspiracy was brutally suppressed. Dozens of people were hanged from the walls of the Château d'Amboise, and the young king and queen had to watch the executions. And then, in December of 1560, after another ear infection that developed into a brain abscess, the 17-year-old King Francis II died in the arms of his inconsolable wife. He had reigned for only 17 months. With her husband's death, Mary's world collapsed. Overnight, she went from being an all-powerful queen to a dowager queen, a foreigner. Power immediately passed to Catherine de' Medici, who became regent for her young son, Charles IX. The Guises lost their influence. There was no longer a place for Mary at the French court. Catherine, not hiding her triumph, suggested she retire from court. Mary spent her 40-day mourning in seclusion, dressed in white, as was customary for French queens. This image, known as the White Queen, added another touch to her legend. But behind the outward grief lay bewilderment. What should she do next? Remain in France in a secondary role? Marry some European prince? Or after all, return home? Meanwhile, alarming news was coming from Scotland. During her absence, the country had changed beyond recognition. Protestantism, fueled by the fiery sermons of the returned from exile John Knox, had triumphed. The Catholic Church was dismantled, monasteries were dissolved, and the Mass was banned. In 1560, her mother, Mary of Guise, died, having tried to the last to hold back the tide of the Reformation. Now, Protestant lords, led by her half-brother, Lord James Stuart, ruled Scotland, and they were calling her back. But they were not calling for a Catholic, absolutist queen raised at the Valois court. They were calling for a symbol of national sovereignty, hoping they could control her for their own interests. Mary made her decision. After 13 years of absence, she would return to her wild, harsh, but native land. In August 1561, casting a last mournful glance at the receding shores of her beloved France, she set sail for Scotland. Her youth, full of splendor and hope, was left behind. Ahead of her lay fog, intrigue, and blood. The ship, shrouded in a fog as thick as milk, carried her not just across the sea, but across a chasm of time and cultures. She was leaving a world of exquisite poetry and courtly balls for a country where the blade was the main argument in a dispute, and instead of the lute, stern psalms were sung. The 18-year-old widow, raised as the future ruler of two of the greatest kingdoms, was returning to her own, which had become almost foreign to her. She brought with her French dresses, court musicians, and the Catholic faith. But the Scotland she encountered demanded something entirely different. The question was not whether the queen could change her country, but whether this country would not break its queen. On August 19th, 1561, Mary Stuart's galley entered the port of Leith, the harbor of Edinburgh. Her arrival was unexpected, due to a thick fog, which the Scots later called an omen. Her fleet arrived several days earlier than expected. There was no ceremonial welcome, no cheering crowd. Instead, she was met by a gray sky, a piercing wind, and the grim looks of a few port workers. The contrast with France was stunning. Edinburgh appeared to her not as a brilliant capital, but as a cramped, foul-smelling medieval town with narrow, dirty streets where slops were thrown from the windows directly onto the cobblestones. The Palace of Holyrood House, though a royal residence, seemed to her, after the Louvre and Fontainebleau, a stern, gloomy fortress. The Scottish nobility gathered to welcome their queen, looked at her with poorly concealed suspicion. To them she was a foreigner, a Frenchwoman, a Catholic, a girl spoiled by luxury who knew nothing of the realities of their country, where the power of the lords in their own lands was often stronger than that of the crown. Her authority, in France backed by the full might of an absolutist state, was here in Scotland more theoretical. In practice, she had to constantly navigate a web of ancient clan feuds and ever-changing alliances between powerful families like the Hamiltons, Douglases, Gordons, and Stuarts. This was a world where a laird's loyalty belonged first to his clan chief, and only then to a distant crown in Edinburgh. Mary, accustomed to courtly bows and unquestioning obedience, found herself in the role of an arbiter in endless disputes among ravenous wolves. And the realities were harsh. The Scotland she had left as a child was a Catholic country in alliance with France. The Scotland to which she returned was a country of a triumphant Protestant Reformation. The spiritual leader of this revolution was John Knox. To understand the tragedy of Mary Stuart, one must understand who John Knox was. He was not just a priest, he was a force of nature, a prophet on an Old Testament scale. Having spent 19 agonizing months on French galleys as a slave, chained to an oar, and several years in exile where he sat at the feet of John Calvin himself in Geneva, he had absorbed the harshest, most uncompromising form of Protestantism. For Knox, Catholicism was not just an error but idolatry, an abomination in the sight of the Lord, and the Pope of Rome was the Antichrist. The Catholic Mass was for him blasphemy, a ritual of Satan that must be eradicated with fire and sword. He was a man of unbending will, a fiery orator capable of igniting a crowd with fanatical fire, and a convinced misogynist. In 1558 he had published a pamphlet, the first blast of the trumpet against the monstrous regiment of women, directed against the Catholic queens Mary Tudor and Mary of Guise. And now he was to deal with a third Mary, young, beautiful, and, in his eyes, doubly dangerous. Their first meeting took place at Holyrood just a few days after her arrival. It was inevitable. On Sunday, Mary had ordered Mass to be said in her private chapel. This caused an uproar among the Protestants. A mob broke into the palace, threatening to lynch the priest of Baal. Only the intervention of the Queen's half-brother, Lord James, who stood guard at the chapel door, prevented bloodshed. After this, Mary summoned Knox to her. She hoped to charm him as she had charmed all the men at the French court. She met him not as a monarch but as a reasonable woman ready for dialogue. She spoke of the need for religious tolerance, that her subjects could practice their faith if they would allow her to practice her own. But she met a wall of granite. Knox recognized no compromises. He told her directly that subjects have the right to overthrow a monarch who imposes idolatry. He unleashed the full force of his rhetoric on her, condemning her faith, her upbringing, her very self. The young queen, unaccustomed to such treatment, was shocked. She tried to argue with him, using all her logic and education, but in vain. In the end, she could not bear it and burst into tears. For Knox, her tears were merely a display of female cunning and weakness. He left, unshaken. This was the first of their 5 personal meetings, and each was an agonizing ordeal for Mary. She realized it was impossible to reason with this man. Nevertheless, the first years of her reign were surprisingly successful. She proved to be a wise and moderate politician. She did not attempt to abolish the Protestant religion as the state religion, demanding only the right to personal freedom of worship for herself and her immediate circle. Her chief advisers were her half-brother, Lord James Stuart, whom she made Earl of Moray, and the Secretary of State, William Maitland of Lethington. Both were Protestants, but also pragmatic politicians interested in stability. Mary traveled extensively throughout the country to get to know her subjects. Her beauty, charm, and accessibility won over the common people. She presided over meetings of the Privy Council, demonstrating a sharp mind and a good understanding of state affairs. She also tried to improve relations with her formidable neighbor, Elizabeth I. The queens exchanged courteous letters, gifts, and portraits. Mary desperately wanted to obtain from Elizabeth a recognition of her rights to the English throne in the event of Elizabeth's childlessness. She even proposed a personal meeting. Elizabeth, a master of political procrastination, agreed in principle but constantly found pretexts to postpone the meeting. She understood perfectly well that Mary's personal charm could sway the loyalty of her own subjects. The meeting never took place. Mary tried to model court life at Holyrood on the French pattern: balls, masks, hunting, music-making. She was surrounded by her faithful 4 Marys and French courtiers. But for the stern Scottish lords, and especially for John Knox, This merry court was a hotbed of sin and frivolity. Knox, in his sermons from the pulpit of St. Giles's Cathedral, which was only a few hundred meters from the palace, thundered curses against the Queen's dancing and fiddling, seeing them as a prelude to the moral decay of the entire nation. In 1562, Mary demonstrated her resolve by suppressing a rebellion of the powerful Catholic Gordon clan in the north of the country. The Earl of Huntly, the most influential Catholic magnate, was dissatisfied with the rise of the Protestant moray and hoped to force the Queen to change her policy by force. Mary personally led a campaign against him. She slept in tents, rode on horseback like a man, and, according to eyewitnesses, regretted only that she was not a man to know what it is to lie all night in the fields or to walk upon the causeway with a jack and knapskull, a Glasgow buckler and a broadsword. The rebellion was crushed and Huntly was killed. With this act, she proved that she was not a puppet of either Catholics or Protestants, and that she was the true Queen of Scotland. But the main question that concerned everyone in Scotland and beyond remained open. Whom would the Queen marry? Her marriage was not a personal but a state affair of the first importance. The future political orientation of Scotland and the fate of her claims to the English throne depended on her choice of husband. Elizabeth Fils, seeking to control the situation, offered her own favorite and, according to rumors, her lover Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. This was both a generous and an insulting offer. On the one hand, Elizabeth promised, in the event of this marriage, to consider Mary's rights of succession. On the other hand, she was offering the Queen of Scotland, a former Queen of France, her own master of the horse, a man whose reputation was tarnished by the mysterious death of his first wife, Amy Robsart. Mary saw this as a humiliation and politely refused. There were many candidates. The son of King Philip II of Spain, the Infante Don Carlos, was one of them. This marriage would have created a most powerful Catholic alliance, but was a nightmare for Protestant Scotland and England. Swedish, Austrian, and French princes were also considered. But Mary, tired of political games, made her choice with her heart, and this choice proved to be fatal for her. In 1565, her cousin, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, arrived in Scotland from England. He was the son of the Earl of Lennox and Margaret Douglas, the daughter of James IV's widow, Margaret Tudor. This meant that Darnley, like Mary, was a descendant of King Henry VII of England, and also had a claim to the English throne, second only to Mary's. He was tall, fair-haired, handsome, and possessed exquisite manners. The 19-year-old Darnley seemed to Mary like a prince from a fairy tale. She fell head over heels in love with him, with the all-consuming passion of which her nature was capable. She saw in him not only a beloved man, but also an ideal husband consort. Their marriage would strengthen her own claims to the English throne. Her advisors Moray and Maitland were horrified. They knew Darnley's true nature. Behind the handsome exterior hid a vain, arrogant, ambitious, foolish, and vicious youth, prone to drunkenness and debauchery. They begged the Queen to reconsider. Elizabeth I, furious that this marriage, uniting two claimants to her throne, had been arranged behind her back, forbade it. But Mary was adamant. She dismissed Moray, her loyal brother, who refused to sanction the marriage. She ignored the threats from England. On July 29, 1565, the 22-year-old Mary Stuart married the 19-year-old Lord Darnley. She made him king consort. The honeymoon was short. Very soon Mary realized what a monstrous mistake she had made. They say love is blind. In Mary Stuart's case, it proved not only blind but also deaf to the voice of reason, and it led her to the edge of an abyss. She had chosen a husband whose beauty was but a mask hiding a rotten soul. This union, born of passion, quickly turned into a battlefield of vanity, jealousy, and political ambition. And in this dark drama, new, even darker figures took the stage. a cunning Italian secretary, a jealous and perpetually drunk king consort, and a brutal border lord. The threads of intrigue were woven into such a tight knot that only a sword could cut it. And very soon blood would be shed within the walls of Holyrood, blood that would forever stain the Queen's reputation and become the beginning of her end. Marriage to Darnley was a disaster from the first days. As soon as he received the title of king, Darnley showed his true colors. He demanded from Mary the crown matrimonialis, that is, the right to the throne in the event of her death, effectively equal power with her. Mary, already deeply disappointed in her husband, refused. This threw Darnley into a rage. He spent his time in the taverns and brothels of Edinburgh, staging drunken brawls, insulting the lords and boasting of his power. He turned out to be not only a worthless ruler but also an unbearable husband. Mary, pregnant with their first child, grew increasingly distant from him. She found solace in her work and in the company of her small circle of confidants. A special place among them was held by David Rizzio, her private secretary for French affairs. Rizzio was an Italian from Piedmont who had started as a singer in the court chapel. He was not handsome, but he was intelligent, educated, devoted to the Queen, and was one of the few with whom she could speak in her native language of European court intrigue and culture. He became her closest advisor, effectively her first minister. This provoked the fierce hatred of the Scottish Protestant lords. This hatred was multi-layered, like an aged wine poisoned with venom. Firstly, it was xenophobia, contempt for a foreign upstart. Secondly, it was aristocratic pride. How dare this base-born musician occupy a place that belonged to them by right of blood? Thirdly, and most importantly, it was political fear. The lords, who had enriched themselves with lands confiscated from the Catholic Church, were terrified that Rizzio, as a supposed papal agent, would persuade the Queen to launch a counter-reformation and take back their spoils. Rizzio became a convenient scapegoat, the embodiment of all their fears. Darnley, consumed by jealousy and suspicion that Rizzio was not only his wife's advisor but also her lover, which was most likely a baseless rumor, easily fell into their trap. Thus a conspiracy was born. A group of Protestant lords led by Lord Ruthven and Patrick Lord Lindsay made a deal with Darnley. They promised him the very crown matrimonial he so coveted. In return, he was to help them get rid of Rizzio and sanction the return from exile of the Earl of Moray and other lords who had fled after Mary's wedding. The denouement came on the evening of March 9th, 1566. Mary, 6 months pregnant, was having supper in her small private cabinet in the palace of Holyrood House. With her were her half-sister, the Countess of Argyll, and David Rizzio. Suddenly, the secret staircase leading from Darnley's apartments opened, and the king consort himself entered the room. He went up to Mary and embraced her. It was a Judas kiss, a signal for the conspirators. Following him, armed lords burst into the room. Their faces were contorted with hatred, and they were led by Lord Ruthven, as pale as death, having just risen from his sickbed. He accused Rizzio of treason. Mary jumped up, instinctively shielding her terrified secretary with her body while simultaneously covering her belly. She ordered them to get out, her voice ringing with rage and fear. She reminded them that she was their queen and that she was carrying the heir to the throne, their future king, in her womb. For a moment it seemed her royal anger would stop them, but it was too late. They were drunk on wine and hatred. They pushed her aside. Darnley, her own husband, seized her, holding her while the other conspirators dragged Rizzio, who was clinging to her dress, away. He was dragged into the adjacent antechamber and there, in full view, brutally stabbed. 56 knife wounds were counted on his body. The dagger left in the body belonged to Lord Darnley, like a sinister autograph on a bloody work of art. This was not just a murder, it was a ritual humiliation of the monarchy, a public slap in the face to the Queen. She had been humiliated, terrified and shown that her power was worthless. The conspirators effectively placed her under house arrest in her own palace, forcing her to look at the pool of her secretary and friend's blood. But they had underestimated Mary. At that moment, she showed incredible composure and courage. Recovering from the shock, she realized that her only chance of salvation was the weakest and most contemptible of her enemies, her husband. She pretended to forgive him. She played on his cowardice and stupidity, convincing him that the lords would deceive him just as they had deceived her. She made him see the conspirators not as allies but as rivals who, having used him, would get rid of him as well. And Darnley, frightened by what he had done, switched sides again. At night, while the conspirators feasted celebrating their victory, Mary and Darnley escaped from Holyrood. On horseback, despite her pregnancy, they rode all night to Dunbar Castle, where they gathered loyal troops. Returning to Edinburgh at the head of an army, Mary regained control. The conspirators fled to England. She pardoned her brother Moray, allowing him to return, but she never trusted him again. And for her husband Darnley, she now felt only icy contempt and disgust. The brutal murder committed before her eyes had become a psychological Rubicon. It had destroyed not only her feelings for Darnley, but also her faith in the Scottish nobility. The convenient absence of her brother Moray during the conspiracy and the participation of so many lords engendered a deep paranoia in her. She realized she could trust none of them. In this vacuum of trust and a desperate search for unconditional loyalty and strength, the figure of Bothwell, with his straightforward loyalty and readiness to act rather than intrigue, began to seem her only salvation. On June 19th, 1566, in Edinburgh Castle, Mary gave birth to a son, James, the future King James VI of Scotland and James III of England. The birth of an heir strengthened her position, but it could not save her marriage. Her relationship with Darnley was destroyed forever, and here the third fatal figure in Mary's life enters the stage, James Hepburn, 4th Earl of Bothwell. Bothwell was the complete opposite of Darnley. He was a rough, ambitious, brave to the point of recklessness border lord, a man of action, not words. He was a Protestant, but had always remained loyal to the crown and her mother, Mary of Guise. He was one of the few who had not betrayed Mary. After Rizzio's murder, his influence at court grew sharply. Mary, surrounded by traitors, saw in him her only support, the only strong man she could rely on. Gradually, this dependence grew into something more. Whether she fell in love with him or simply saw him as her salvation, historians still debate. But it is clear that Bothwell came to dominate her will. The problem of Darnley required a solution. He had become unbearable. He was ill, probably with syphilis, threatened Mary, and intrigued against her. In December 1566, a conference of lords, including Moray, Maitland, Bothwell, and others, took place at Craigmillar Castle. They proposed a divorce from Darnley to Mary. But Mary, fearing that a divorce would cast doubt on her son's legitimacy, refused. Then, according to some, Maitland said, "Madam, care ye not. We shall find a way to be quit of him without prejudice to your son." Did Mary sign the so-called Craigmillar Bond, giving tacit consent to her husband's elimination? This is one of the most controversial points of her biography. In early 1567, Darnley, who was recovering in Glasgow, returned to the outskirts of Edinburgh. A secluded house at a place called Kirklefield near the city wall was prepared for him. Mary visited him, showing an apparent reconciliation. On the night of February 9th to 10th, 1567, Mary spent the evening with her husband but then left for Holyrood for the wedding of one of her servants. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, all of Edinburgh was awakened by a deafening explosion. The house at Kirklefield was blown up. Barrels of gunpowder were found in the ruins, and in the garden, at some distance from the house under a tree, the bodies of Darnley and his servant were found. They had no marks of fire or explosion on them. They were dressed only in their nightshirts. They had been strangled. Who killed Darnley? Public opinion and Mary's political enemies immediately pointed to Bothwell as the perpetrator and to the Queen herself as the instigator. This story is dark and convoluted. Most likely it was a conspiracy of the lords in which Bothwell played a key role. They wanted to get rid of an inconvenient king and at the same time frame the Queen in order to then remove her from power. Did Mary participate? There is no direct proof of her guilt, but her subsequent actions were so unwise that they convinced many of her complicity. She took no serious steps to investigate the murder. The trial of Bothwell, whom everyone openly called the murderer, was a farce. He appeared in court surrounded by 4,000 of his armed supporters, and the prosecution witnesses were simply afraid to come. He was acquitted. Moreover, shortly after the trial, on April 19th, Bothwell gathered the leading lords of the kingdom for a supper at Ainsley's Tavern. There, after copious libations, he proposed that they sign a document that went down in history as the Ainsley Tavern Bond. In this paper, the lords not only declared Bothwell innocent of the murder, but also recommended him as the best husband for the Queen. The document was signed by 8 bishops, 9 earls, and 7 lords, including many of those who would later rebel against Mary for this very marriage. It was an act of cynical hypocrisy designed on the one hand to secure the lords themselves and on the other to push the Queen towards a fatal step by giving her a false sense of general approval. And then on April 24th, 1567, an event occurred that definitively ruined Mary's reputation. Bothwell allegedly abducted the Queen as she was returning from Stirling and took her to his castle at Dunbar. Whether it was an abduction or a staged event with Mary's consent remains another mystery. At Dunbar, as Mary's enemies later claimed, he raped her to force her to marry him. 3 months after her husband's murder, on May 15th, 1567, Mary Stuart, Queen of Scotland, married James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, the chief suspect in that murder. The ceremony was a Protestant one which alienated her last Catholic supporters. This act was the last straw for the Scottish lords. They had what they wanted, a moral pretext for rebellion. Uniting in a confederacy, they declared they were saving the Queen from the murderer and tyrant Bothwell. Even those who had themselves participated in the conspiracy against Darnley and signed the paper at Ainsley's Tavern now acted as avengers for his death. On June 15, 1567, the two armies, the Queen's and the Confederates, met at Carberry Hill. There was no battle. Mary's troops were melting away. Her soldiers did not want to fight for Bothwell. In the end, after long negotiations, Mary agreed to surrender to the lords in exchange for a promise that Bothwell would be allowed to leave. She said goodbye to her third husband. They would never see each other again. Bothwell fled to Scandinavia, where he was captured, went mad, and died in a Danish prison. And Mary, instead of the promised honors, was brought to Edinburgh as a prisoner. The crowd, which had so recently adored her, now met her with cries of "Whore!" and "Murderer!" She was imprisoned in Loch Leven Castle, located on an island in the middle of a lake. Her jailer was Lady Douglas, the Earl of Moray's mother, who claimed to have once been James Vavey's mistress and that Moray, not Mary, was his legitimate heir. In Loch Leven Castle, under pressure and threats, broken and ill. In captivity, she had a miscarriage and, as it turned out, had been pregnant with twins by Bothwell. On July 24th, 1567, Mary Stuart signed her abdication from the throne in favor of her 1-year-old son, James. Her brother, the Earl of Moray, was appointed regent. Her reign in Scotland, which had lasted only 6 years, was over. It seemed to be the end, but for Mary Stuart it was only the beginning of a new, longest, and most tragic act of her life. The act of a captive. She fled seeking refuge with her dear sister, the Queen of England. She hoped for royal solidarity, for a monarch's help to a monarch. But instead of open arms, she found stone walls, and instead of sympathy, she received cold calculation. For Mary Stuart, England became not a haven but a trap. The golden cage in which she would spend the next 19 years was slowly turning into her tomb. She had arrived in England as a petitioner, but she very soon became for Elizabeth the most dangerous prisoner in the world, a living symbol of Catholic resistance, a magnet for all conspiracies, and a headache that could only be cured in one way. On the night of May 2nd, 1568, with the help of a few loyal servants, including the young Willie Douglas, Mary made a daring escape from Loch Leven Castle. Disguised as a laundress, she crossed the lake in a boat. On the shore, loyal supporters were already waiting for her. In a few days, she managed to raise an army of 6,000. Hope flared in her heart again. But on May 13th, at the Battle of Langside near Glasgow, her hastily assembled troops were utterly routed by the professional army of the Regent Moray. It was all over. Fleeing for her life, Mary, with a handful of followers, rode without stopping for 3 days and 3 nights until she reached the southern border of Scotland. She faced a choice: flee to France, where she was Queen Dowager, but where the unfriendly Catherine de' Medici now ruled, or seek refuge in England with her cousin Elizabeth. She chose the latter. It was her last and most fatal mistake. She wrote a touching letter to Elizabeth, believing that she, as a woman and a queen, would understand and help her regain her throne. On May 16th, 1568, Mary Stuart, without money, without a retinue, in simple clothes, crossed the Solway Firth in a fishing boat and set foot on English soil. For Elizabeth I, Mary's arrival was a colossal problem. What to do with her? To receive her at court was impossible. It would mean legitimizing a claimant to her own throne, who would immediately become a center of attraction for all dissatisfied Catholics. To help her regain the Scottish crown by force would mean quarreling with the Protestant lords of Scotland, her allies, and affirming the principle that subjects have no right to overthrow a monarch, which was dangerous for Elizabeth herself, whose rights many disputed. To send her to France or Spain would be even worse. It would mean handing a powerful weapon against herself into the hands of her main enemies. Elizabeth chose a fourth path: to detain Mary in England under the pretext of investigating the circumstances of Darnley's death. She could not try Mary, an anointed queen, but she could conduct an inquiry to decide if she was guilty and whether she should be helped. Mary was placed under honorable arrest, first at Carlisle Castle and then at Bolton Castle. A long investigation began. In York and then in Westminster, a commission of English lords convened. Representatives of Mary and her enemies from Scotland, led by the Regent Moray, arrived there. And here Moray dealt his main blow. He presented the commission with a casket of letters, allegedly found after Bothwell's flight. These were the famous casket letters, consisting of 8 letters and several sonnets, supposedly written in Mary's hand, to Bothwell before Darnley's murder. If they were genuine, they proved not only her passionate love for Bothwell, but also her direct involvement in the conspiracy to murder her husband. Mary vehemently denied the authenticity of the letters, calling them a crude forgery. Historians still debate their authenticity today. The originals were lost, only copies remain. Some letters were probably genuine love letters, others forgeries, and still others a skillful compilation of different documents. But for Elizabeth, it did not matter. She did not need a verdict. She needed a pretext. The inquiry ended in nothing. Elizabeth declared that Mary's guilt was not proven, but neither was her innocence evident. And since that was the case, she could neither help her nor release her. Mary Stuart remained in England as a guest who could not leave. Her prison was becoming more and more apparent. Thus began 19 long years of captivity. She was moved from castle to castle, among them Tutbury, Wingfield, Chatsworth, and Sheffield. It was a life in a golden cage where the bars, though gilded, remained bars. Her main jailer for many years was George Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, one of the richest men in England. This duty, imposed on him by Elizabeth, became a financial and personal disaster for Shrewsbury. The maintenance of the Queen and her retinue, she was allowed a small court of 40 people, cost a colossal amount of money, which the Crown reimbursed reluctantly and not in full, bringing the Earl to the brink of ruin. His domineering and enterprising wife, the famous Bess of Hardwicke, who was at first friendly with Mary, eventually became fiercely jealous of her husband's beautiful and charming prisoner, spreading rumors of their affair. This constant stress eventually destroyed the Talbots' marriage. Mary's life became a monotonous routine, a struggle against boredom and despair. She read a great deal, did embroidery. Her complex needlework, full of secret symbols and Catholic allegories, has survived to this day, played the lute, and cared for her lapdogs and birds. But her main activity was secret correspondence. With the help of loyal servants and sophisticated methods, hiding coded notes in the most unexpected places, she wrote letters to her supporters in France and Scotland, to the Pope, and to the King of Spain. She wove webs of conspiracy, desperately trying to break free. The years of captivity and lack of movement undermined her health. She suffered from rheumatism and chronic pain, and her legendary beauty began to fade under the weight of illness and unfulfilled hopes. It was her presence in England that provoked a whole series of Catholic conspiracies against Elizabeth. The first was the Ridolfi plot in 1571. The Italian banker Roberto Ridolfi developed a plan for Spanish troops to land in England, overthrow Elizabeth, free Mary, and place her on the throne as the wife of Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, the noblest aristocrat in England. The plot was uncovered by the all-seeing spy network of Elizabeth's Secretary of State, Sir Francis Walsingham. Norfolk was executed. Mary got away with a tightening of her confinement. Then followed the Throckmorton plot in 1583. A young Catholic, Francis Throckmorton, was a go-between in a conspiracy that involved an invasion by French troops under the command of the Duke of Guise, Mary's cousin, and an uprising of English Catholics. Walsingham again intercepted the correspondence. Throckmorton was tortured on the rack and confessed everything. The last and fatal one was the Babington plot in 1586. A young and ardent Catholic, Anthony Babington, and his friends plotted to assassinate Elizabeth and free Mary. But all their correspondence with Mary was controlled by Walsingham from the very beginning. He had found a way to decipher her secret code. He even replaced the man who secretly carried letters in beer barrels with his own double agent. Walsingham waited patiently until he had irrefutable proof in his hands. A letter in which Mary not only knew about the conspiracy but also explicitly approved the plan to assassinate Elizabeth. When such a letter was obtained, the trap snapped shut. Babington and his accomplices were arrested and brutally executed, and in August 1586, English officers burst into Mary's chambers at Chartley Castle. Her papers were confiscated. She was informed that she would stand trial for treason. The trial took place in October 1586 at Fotheringhay Castle. Mary at first refused to recognize the jurisdiction of an English court, declaring that she was a sovereign monarch and could answer only to God. "I am a queen by birth, and I will not demean my rank, nor my lineage, nor the kingdom of Scotland, nor my son by answering as a criminal before English lords." But she was persuaded that silence would be taken as an admission of guilt. She defended herself without a lawyer before the most sophisticated jurists in England, and she did so brilliantly. Day after day, she parried their accusations. Her mind, honed by years of court intrigue and long hours of reading, was her only weapon. She demolished the prosecutors, pointing out that she had not been provided with copies of the letters she was accused of, that the evidence was based on testimony extracted under torture from the Babington conspirators. She demanded a confrontation with her accusers and their spies, which was, of course, denied. She directly accused Walsingham, who sat among the judges, of forgery, declaring, "All this has been done by you, Sir Francis, to ruin me." But the verdict was a foregone conclusion. The commission of 46 English lords unanimously found her guilty of conspiring against the life of Queen Elizabeth. Now the decision rested with Elizabeth. She hesitated. To execute an anointed queen, her own cousin, was an unheard-of step. It created a dangerous precedent. She feared revenge from the Catholic powers, France and Spain, and the reaction of Mary's son, King James of Scotland. She tried to find other ways out, hinting to Mary's jailer that he could rid her of the problem, that is, kill the prisoner secretly. But he refused. The Parliament and the Privy Council pressured Elizabeth, demanding she sign the death warrant. All of England lived in fear of a new conspiracy. Finally, on February 1st, 1587, Elizabeth I signed the warrant. But even after this, she claimed she had not wanted it to be carried out and blamed her secretary, Davison, who had allegedly passed it on for execution without her final order. In any case, the warrant was sent to Fotheringhay. The circle was complete. The story that had begun in a royal cradle was to end on a scaffold. Mary Stuart's death was not the end of her story. On the contrary, it was its immortal beginning. In the eyes of Catholic Europe, she instantly became a martyr for the faith. Her tragic image, captured in poems, plays, and paintings, became for centuries a symbol of a romantic heroine, a victim of a cruel political game and female jealousy. What was the real reaction to her execution? Philip II of Spain used it as one of the pretexts for sending his invincible armada to the shores of England in 1588. The armada was defeated, which only strengthened the position of Elizabeth and Protestant England. France, torn by its own religious wars, limited itself to a formal protest. And what of her son, James VI of Scotland? He also expressed official indignation but took no real action. He was a pragmatist. The main prize for him was the English throne, and he understood that a war with Elizabeth would deprive him of all chances. He chose inheritance over revenge. And the irony of fate is that in the end it was Mary who won. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, died in 1603, leaving no heir, and the son of her sworn rival, James VI of Scotland, ascended the English throne, becoming King James I of England. He united the two crowns, fulfilling the dream of many generations of monarchs. The Tudor dynasty died out, and the era of the Stuarts in England began. James ordered the remains of his mother to be moved from Peterborough to Westminster Abbey, the main necropolis of English kings. Her tomb was placed next to the tomb of Elizabeth, her eternal rival. The two queens, who had been enemies all their lives, rested side by side in death. So who was Mary Stuart? Was she a holy martyr, as some believe, or a vicious intriguer and murderer, as others claim? The truth, as always, is more complex. She was neither. She was a woman of her era, thrown into a whirlwind of events that were stronger than she was. She possessed many qualities necessary for a monarch, such as intelligence, courage, and charm, but she lacked the most important one: political intuition and the ability to judge people. Raised in the refined but artificial atmosphere of the French court, she was unprepared for the harsh, treacherous reality of Scottish politics. Her tragedy is a tragedy of choice. She chose the wrong husband. She chose the wrong advisors. She chose the wrong country to flee to. Every step she took, dictated by her heart rather than her head, led her closer to the scaffold. In a world ruled by men, her femininity, her passion, her beauty were both her strength and her weakness. Her story is an eternal reminder of how closely the personal and the political are intertwined, how one human destiny can reflect and change the history of entire nations. Mary Stuart lost her life, but she won immortality in the memory of posterity, remaining one of the most enigmatic, tragic, and irresistible figures in world history. Her ghost still roams the castles of Scotland and England, and her story continues to move and inspire, making us ask again and again, who were you, Queen of Scots?